Welcome to our campfire. Thank you for joining our intimate gathering. Anybody who wants their brain to become enlarged, to be armed, to understand the world's newest superpower, you should be here, sitting down. We are going to talk about China and its relationship with Europe. And it's a kind of frenemy relationship. There's pretty strong trade dependency, but lots of political complexity. The Economist just said Mr. Xi is the world's most powerful person, which probably didn't go down too well in the White House. But he's just cemented his position, and Chinese growth in all sorts of sectors is hitting that exponential curve. China has said it is intending to be the world's dominant AI power in just over a decade, and they're really pushing together. We have 4 people here, experts in various fields, who are going to give some insights. Next to me, Sophal nearly next to me, Sophal is an associate professor of diplomacy and world affairs in California at Occidental College, and has also co-written a book about China called The Hungry Dragon, How China's Quest for Resources is Shaping the World. Zachary, Karabell, just next to Sophal, also writes books. He wrote a book called Superfusion about America and China and their economic fusion. But as well as having run Chinese investments for a long time, he is head of global strategy at InvestNet, dealing with financial services. Tomas Valasek, at Carnegie Europe, director, is looking into security, defense, transatlantic relations, formerly Slovakia's ambassador to NATO. And finally, Aman Verjee from 500 Startups, having worked with big companies such as eBay and PayPal, is now investing in China. 500 has about 2 dozen investments in China, and he's run teams there. Zachary, I'm going to ask you to kick off with, in framing this conversation, what do you think this room needs to know about the reality of how China and the West will be interacting?
So I'm going to do the really big picture, 30,000 foot, and maybe the others will do a little more specific. It's interesting. Donald Trump, some of you may have heard of him, new president of the United States, former real estate developer. Anyway, you should look him up. He is in Beijing today and yesterday, and repeated a line that's very familiar of trade deficits are helping China and hurting the United States. And in many ways, the trade picture between the European Union and China is almost exactly the same as the trade picture between the United States and China. It's about $500 to $600 billion of aggregate trade of stuff. It's a little less in Europe, but we're still talking about the same. And it's about 2/3 exports, 1/3 imports. So there's a 170 billion euro trade deficit between the EU and China. There's a $250 billion trade deficit between the United States and China. And that, from nationalist perspectives, is seen as, oh, this is a negative thing China's, taking, and whoever the we is on the other side of that is giving. And I think that's probably the most flawed way of understanding how these relationships works, really rooted in mid-20th century concepts of how economies work. And almost entirely, by the way, when these numbers are bandied about, miss 2 crucial things. One, so if you think about the EU, the fastest growing part of trade with China is exports to China. 10 years ago, it was about 50 billion euros. Now it's about 150 billion euros. And it was about 200 billion imports, and it's about 350 now. So that's grown, but the proportional growth of exports has gone much more. Same thing is true of the United States. China is the fastest growing export market for American goods because China still has not excelled at or focused on high-end finished goods. It might eventually, it probably will eventually, but that's not been the trajectory. So that's everything from high-end steel to high-end machinery. The thing that is also completely missed, which is increasingly important for something like Web Summit and for a lot of our attitudes here, is services. So anything that's intangible, IP, ideas, and that manifests itself in manufactured goods. So every time Apple, you should look them up. They make these cool little personal digital devices, and it's a tough crowd. I mean, I get it. We've been here a long time. I'll be here till like 5.
Oh man!
Every time Apple sells an iPhone to the United States or Europe, it shows up as the wholesale cost of the good when it enters the port, whatever port it is. So every time an iPhone gets sold in the United States, it shows up as a $200 export trade deficit with China. But if you break down an iPhone and you look at the amount of components that actually go to China, it's probably about $10 or $12 for labor in a Foxconn factory in Shenzhen. And the rest of it is dispersed across a really global supply chain, from IP in Cupertino to Samsung to Qualcomm to Philips to Siemens to Infineon, all of which are, in different countries. And if you broke it out, you'd have a very different trade picture. But we don't do that because our trade numbers don't do that. And I just think that may come eventually, but governments would have to start insisting on it. Companies would have to start breaking it out and revealing transparently what their supply chains are. And I am relatively convinced, and I'm not just saying this provocatively, that if we actually understood the nature of trade and where value flows, you actually wouldn't have a trade deficit with China in any meaningful way between China and the United States. And then add in services, and I'll finish with that. So tangible services we measure, but we don't even measure those very well. So every time a Chinese tourist comes to Lisbon or New York, that is technically, in trade terms, an export, a Portuguese export of trade services to China, or a U.S. export of travel services to China. The only way you can assess the value of that is port of entry customs officials do a voluntary / mandatory survey of outgoing tourists and ask them how much money they have spent in the country. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm a Chinese tourist in the United States and a U.S. customs official asks me how much money I've spent, and you've just spent like $8,000 in cash, I'm not sure you have a deep incentive to do anything other than not tell the truth or to get really nervous. And then you multiply it by the number of visas. I mean, I feel like I should be making this up and it should be funny, but this is the only way we know how to do these things. And I'm almost sure that it vastly undercounts the way we understand. And that's just tourism, let alone, banking IP or technology ideas, which we don't even know how to count.
Zachary, to
that was finished.
Should we actually care if there's a trade deficit in China's favor at scale?
Given what I've just said, no. We should care about where value is flowing and whether the relationship is mutually profitable. Unfortunately, we're using a flawed dashboard to make very consequential national decisions.
Sophal, you have studied China's economic imperialism, China's thirst for resources.
Right.
Are you relaxed about the growing economic might, and particularly an imbalance in trade with Europe, with the US?
Well, I think that there's reason to be concerned. And if one looks at the trajectory of China, when we talk about the rise of China, we have to remember in the bigger context, it's really the return of China. China returning to its rightful position in terms of its population as a percentage of the world's population to where it was 200 years ago, because the Industrial Revolution essentially made the difference between China and the West in terms of accelerating the West's economic growth and leaving China behind. China is now exploiting the same technologies that were not available before and returning to its rightful position. But as to your question, I think that there is concern. I mean, when we talk about the trope of China seeding illiberal regimes, for example, throughout Central and Eastern Europe, which we know isn't true, it is still helping as a model to guide certain countries that I've studied, Cambodia in particular, to become less liberal. It uses, these countries are autocratic, but they use China as a way of saying, look, if you cut off our foreign aid, we'll just go to China. We'll just get money from China. And they are getting lots of money from China. And as a result, they're able to then say, well, we'll follow Xi Jinping thought. We'll follow his crackdown on corruption, which we can then deploy in our country. We'll follow the same sorts of tactics. And then it becomes a model for these countries to essentially say that, yeah, you know, it's nice to have friends like China because they don't ask questions about human rights. They don't ask questions about democracy. They're not promoters of human rights or democracy.
So the risk is economic imperialism manifest as political control.
That's right.
Now, Tomas, how much of a myth is there as to China's involvement in places like Central Europe to try and push for political change, push for regime change?
An interesting contrast with what Sophal has just said, because of course the most common worry one hears in relation to Chinese investments in Europe is the sort of imperialism, particularly because the spike in Chinese investments has coincided with a turn in many European countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, towards a less liberal, more illiberal political model, you know, less acceptance of and tolerance for independent media, independent judiciary, and many link the two. They assume, ooh, China has come in as a significant source of investment.
Give us an example, a specific country.
Well, I mean, Poland and Hungary come to mind, or actually Poland is a bad example, but Hungary and the Czech Republic, both quite prominent receivers of Chinese investments. In Hungary's case, also quite a prominent investor in China. There's a Hungarian company that shows up on the top 20 biggest investors in China. I believe an aluminum company, you may know more. But it's been a case of two countries in Central Europe expanding a business with China extensively at the same time as they've taken seemingly a turn away from democracy. So the easy conclusion is, ooh, China is clearly responsible. It's given them another foreign policy option, and now they are exploiting it. I think it's bogus, frankly. It really is a myth. That's not to say that in other parts of the world it doesn't play out that way. What you see when you scratch beneath the surface in Central and Eastern Europe is that the turn away from this sort of liberal Western democratic capitalism precedes the spike in Chinese investment has really more to do, and I'm only going to give it the short version. I'm happy to go into it in Q&A, but it really has more to do with the search in Central and Eastern Europe for an identity other than the quickly adopted post-1989, post-communist Western identity that they had adopted wholesale, imported overnight. That was kind of the model for 30 years. What you see those countries doing now is trying to come up with their own national way of arranging their domestic societies. A process that's not altogether different from Brexit, and the way that Britain is trying to redefine its relationship with the EU and redefine what it's about. What is the historical moments, points that I feel proud about? Is it the EU or is it the Commonwealth and my colonial past? And you see similar process unfolding in Central and Eastern Europe. The soul-searching, the turn away from liberal democracy started long before and the Chinese investments, and it's far more spurred by domestic drivers.
So you're relaxed about China putting in money strategically into a bunch of European countries?
I think it's been, again, I want to focus on Central and Eastern Europe. That's not to say the investments in numerical terms in other parts of Europe haven't been more significant. They have. The biggest Chinese investments have, of course, gone to United Kingdom, France, Italy, Greece, and Portugal. A very significant recipient of Chinese funds. But it's really been in Central and Eastern Europe where the fears about Chinese influence and political imperialism, if you will, have come to a point because the countries are seen as weaker, they are poorer, the traditions of democracy are less well-rooted, and the fear was this is the part of the world where the Chinese investments will make a real difference. Well, they haven't, for reasons I have laid out earlier. One also tends to forget that for all the new Chinese money that has flowed in, it is still dwarfed by order of magnitude by the EU money that is coming into these countries. You know, human eyes tends to follow movement, not mass. So we'd get excited about the new $100 million dollar investment here, 50 or 80 million investment there. We forget that Hungary, the country I mentioned earlier, receives indirect grants only, not counting foreign direct investment from Western European countries and from the United States. In direct grants from the European Commission budget, it receives an amount that's equivalent of 6% of GDP.
Okay, so we've established that there is still a considerable amount of Chinese money coming into Europe, whether or not it's aiming at political change. Aman, you're going the other way. You're trying to put money into the Chinese economy to back the startups that could be high growth through 500 startups. Yeah. How difficult is it putting money in as a foreign investor in China? How many barriers are you facing? Do you see it as a level playing field?
No, I think it's generally pretty difficult. If you're trying to deploy capital into China from the outside, there are a number of things that make it challenging. One is the dynamics of the market are such that the local entrepreneurs have an advantage in network and government support, de facto, de jure. There are all kinds of regulations that they have to that you have to comply with. Two, getting money in and out of the country is highly controlled. So it doesn't give you a lot of liquidity if you're making an investment and trying to hold it for the long term. So we're sort of looking at the region. We like a lot of what we see in terms of the talent and the entrepreneurs and the innovation and the energy. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the long run. But navigating the government and what the government says and what they'll do is it's a little bit of a guessing game, and there's not a lot of transparency, at least by Western American standards or Western European standards.
And the government in Beijing has also said it expects to take a stake in a bunch of the big companies, the DDs, the Alibabas.
Yeah, they have said that, and they'll start right from the get-go. If you want to invest in China, you've got to co-invest with local entrepreneurs, and the government will tell you who to co-invest with. So it's not even the big, the DDs, the Tencents, and the Alibabas, but it's also startups at a much earlier age. You have to essentially give up a lot of that ownership to the Chinese government or to their selected winners.
And based on some of the noises coming out of the Chinese research labs, the fact that they are intending to dominate the world in artificial intelligence, for instance, should the West be concerned?
I think it's actually. I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's actually very positive. I think the innovation that China's been able to spur may be different from some of the American companies. They're advantaged in a couple of ways. One is the market is much broader, right? The number of Chinese internet users passed the Americans in about 2008. And now China is the biggest in the world by about 3x. And it's growing by 30% a year. And even now, internet adoption in China is about 52 or 54% versus 86% in Western Europe and somewhere in the low 80s in Portugal. So, there's a huge ramp of users. The markets are much bigger. The time that it takes to get to these billion-dollar outcomes is much faster in China. What we've seen with Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu, and compare that to Amazon in the U.S. and eBay and the American examples, or take like a European example like BlaBlaCar. How long it takes them to get to that kind of velocity? China's just cut that in half. And so I think the innovation cycles are faster. The technology is getting better. The number of mobile payments and mobile users is now far greater than any other country in the world, even on a per capita basis. So I think there are a lot of advantages. If they're building these technologies and using them for nefarious purposes, as directed by some grand government scheme, then obviously we should be worried. But it strikes me right now as the product of a lot of very localized and pushed out innovation that the government is trying to put a regulatory framework on and trying to marshal, but hasn't been able to figure out. At least if they have put together some kind of tops-down direction, I've not been able to figure out what their intention is.
So I go to China 3 or 4 times a year to meet some of these startups to see the scale of growth.
Yeah.
And I come back and see Western companies and think, you have no idea what you're up against, not just in hardware, but in AI. There's a phrase I kept hearing in Beijing among early stage companies: we're a 996 company. What's a 996 company? We expect our team to work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week as a minimum. We're up against something big. So there's a big push at the moment to create what they're calling the Belt and Road program, to create a trade route directly from inner China to the edge of Europe, to Rotterdam. There's a lot of central government push, a lot of private money going into this. Is this a good thing for Europe's relationships with China, or is it going to lead to more value coming one way? Does the panel have a view?
Well, I certainly think that spending $1 trillion worth of money on infrastructure is probably a great thing for the countries that will receive that infrastructure. Of course, it means making it easier for China to do business with that part of the world, including Southeast Asia and Central Asia. But for Europe, it might end up having very positive externalities, making it easier to build the ties that previously would have been impossible.
So you're an optimist.
I hope.
Zachary, are you an optimist about Belt and Road?
I'm still stuck with, I'm more of like a 669 kind of company, 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, 9 months a year. But I don't know if that's a competitive advantage, but it's certainly a better lifestyle. So, look, the one thing about China that strikes me from an American perspective is there's a degree to which the belief that you can transform the conditions of the world by the application of immense sums of money is in part a precondition for doing so, which is not to say that it will succeed, it's just to say it's a precondition for doing so. The belief that that won't work is usually a precondition for not spending the money. And so there's a huge amount of waste that will come from China's Belt and Road Initiative, and Kazakhstan has already spent their oil money inventing new cities, and I'm sure Uzbekistan will do the same. And as the State Department used to call these the Unamistans, the belt of former Soviet republics on the southern tier, which are where a lot of the Silk Road would go to connect.
I think Web Summit is in Kazakhstan next year, isn't it?
More. And Kazakh telephone is here. I actually signed up for a plan. So I do think, as you say, that it will benefit the recipients, and infrastructure, if done well, is always a conduit to more commerce. But I would say, look, a lot of this will not be done well, and I'm not trying to be unfair to Kazakhstan. It's just that when you have top-down spending on projects like Saudi Arabia is going to spend $500 billion to build NEOM, it's gleaming new robotic city in the desert, and it may be incredible or not, but it's a different kind of infrastructure than one driven in the first order by what do we need to facilitate this particular society.
Anybody in the room been to China in the last year or so?
Yeah.
So we're going to bring our friends, our wider group of friends, into the conversation. Were you scared at the progress you saw? Were you excited by it? Do you think the West is aware of how aggressive some of these businesses are growing?
Ignorance in the West is the honest answer. I recently went to Shenzhen with a chap called Carl Pei. He's loitering around. He's one of the co-founders of OnePlus. The speed at which they were able to build their mobile phone business, as a British entrepreneur, I can only dream of.
Right.
And they're getting so smart and so savvy at the emotional side, which has always been our power. As a Brit, we have no real skills except soft skills. And soft power.
And sex scandals.
I think that's...
We're really good at that.
I think that's the world over, let's be quite frank and honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the one thing that scares me. The one thing, so you head to Shenzhen, you smell the drive.
Yep.
You smell the tenacity. And I'm yet to find a single country in Western Europe that matches that. I'm a great believer in London. I'm all about London. I spend my time investing money in London. But yeah, we've got a lot to be afraid of. But a lot to be excited about, because for me the opportunity is how do you amplify multiple levels? They amplify the power on the ground there of building, manufacturing, bringing new brands to life, and infusing them with the vibrancies that you get that they just don't have there. And that's what really excites me, the hybrids, the partnerships.
We made a Wired 1 hour-long documentary last year called Shenzhen, the Silicon Valley of hardware. Yeah. And boy, if you know anybody running a hardware startup and they haven't spent days, weeks in Shenzhen just seeing what they're up against, get them over there now. The mindset, the ambition.
Two things on the one is, yes, if you looked at English travelers to the United States in the late 1890s, like Lord Bryce comes and says, humming with activity, the new republic, everybody's got a scheme, they're trying to make money, they're trying to get ahead. And it was an indication of the contrast between the sentiment in what was then the old world and what was then the new. And there is that feeling about China. The flip side is many of the same things were said about people who went to Tokyo in 1989. And it's not that Japan did not become a massive economic power. They did, and they still are in their way, regardless of what you say about Japan's current economic model and its vibrancy. But it didn't move. It didn't go in quite the direction that people thought it would go in 1989. You know, Japan did not take over the world economically. It did not buy up. So it's just, you know, history moves in, the future moves in really mysterious ways, which I know we all know.
One of the reasons that we're in blissful ignorance in the West is there aren't many Western media outlets reporting from inside China. A bunch of them, like the New York Times, have been banned, and it's hard to get a visa. So I guess one question is, to what extent does the centralized control of information and the censorship actually give China an unfair advantage in creating a new kind of planned economy?
I think it gives it the ability to narrate a story that it wants to project to the world, certainly. One of the interesting aspects, talking with Chinese visitors to Occidental College, was that lots of his students, or certainly some of his students, were celebrating during the electoral campaign in the U.S., Trump possibly winning, because they see it as great for China when a madman like Trump can be in power, because it'll mean that the U.S. won't be able to do what it's supposed to do. And in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, you've got bureaucrats who are essentially looking at the world in a very zero-sum way. They see China as gaining whenever the U.S. loses, which means then using countries like Cambodia to embarrass the U.S. or to cause problems, so that it can then chalk up a point and say, look, the U.S. gets a minus here, and China, as a result, wins.
In the past, whenever a new imperial nation has emerged with dominance pretty quickly and felt the rest of the world doesn't necessarily pay it the respect it's due, there has been the odd war that follows. And there is an argument that at the moment, China is the new economic imperial superstate, and there are already little military games being played, creating new islands in the Pacific. How worried should we be that this little economic war could turn into something bigger? I mean, Tomas, at Carnegie, you think about these things.
Well, we do, and I came from NATO. We think about these things even more so in the defense world. Look, I mean, there is no other way of putting it. Power follows money. China's growth, if sustained, and I think Zachary made all the important disclaimers and caveats that needed to be made, but if sustained, is inevitably going to translate into near hegemony in Asia. And it's just a matter of how we adjust to that. I mean, it's not a popular thing to say, and of course that's not the declared policy of the United States, but when you scratch below the surface, that's what the dilemmas all add up to. But let me also make a slightly different point. We have a tendency to turn China into something that it isn't. I mean, to paint it as this fantastically organized, incredibly well-endowed player that has this capacity, because of its autocratic nature, to throw its resources behind very sophisticated political strategies and get the outcome it wants because it plans 40 years ahead. I found, turning your question upside down, I found that China is often as ignorant about us, if not more so, than we are about it. And its investments in Eastern Europe, I think, prove the point. To name just one example, my favorite example, I was in China recently, about 2 months ago, and I heard this excited talk of a train that has finally made it all the way from China to Poland, because of the progress on the land component of the One Belt, One Road. It's now so well plugged in that you can dispatch a train full of goods to all the way to Warsaw. And I asked, what was it that they brought? Well, you know, electronics, consumer goods, great. And what was it that it was shipped back? Well, apples, which is an interesting story, partly because it says, well, there isn't that much we can export, certainly Eastern Europe, though I'm pleased to say Western Europe now exports more. But there is a different story that I suspect the Chinese never got. Apples are a highly political statement. When after the 2014 war between Ukraine and Russia, EU imposes sanctions on Russia. Russia responds by imposing counter sanctions. One of the hardest hit industry sectors in Europe are Polish apple producers who lost 80% of their export market. So the Polish government started walking around the world giving away these freedom apples at various meetings of summits and meetings of ministers. The message was, we're not going to be cowed by Moscow. So for the Poles to dispatch a trainload of apples to China through Russia was a giant middle finger raised at the Moscow regime. And I don't think the Chinese interlocutors ever got it. My sense is they're probably dragged into a political game that they don't understand, and in some ways we're woefully unprepared for. So the notion that they are these sophisticated players who know what they are getting into doesn't really bear, the closer examination.
When the Chinese first heard about it, they thought they were being sent a shipload of these.
Probably.
Do any of the smart people in the room want to ask a question? Make an observation? We're in our last couple of minutes.
Actually, I have a question for Aman.
You're not in the audience.
I know, but
Be democratic here.
I have a question.
This is not one party rule.
As they're mulling.
As they're mulling, go ahead.
Do you think China is going to excel with entrepreneurship? Because they certainly haven't to date. I mean, with fintech to some degree.
Will they excel with entrepreneurship?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think eventually. I'm maybe more optimistic than than the view about the initial question about the imperial economy with control over information. I think back to how economies have developed over time, when resources were the thing that you were trading for, maybe fighting for. When Europeans came to America, they first traded for resources. Then when they couldn't get them, they took them. And maybe there's a fine line between trade and trade wars and war. But look at how the China is developing now in the post-industrial age, the information age. What is the most popular app in the world? Anyone know?
WeChat.
Yeah, WhatsApp. It's essentially a messenger, a service that Tencent has developed. Almost 1 million active users, and the predominant users are very young, very female Chinese users. And I've got 2 daughters, 6 and 3. I know how hard it is to keep them from chit-chatting on their own and to control the information. As a father, I can't control the information. No matter how good a government you are, no matter how resourceful, how clever, no matter what kind of military and other power you wield, containing something like WeChat is very, very difficult. And eventually, I think it'll proliferate into broad information, discussion, entrepreneurship, risk-taking. I think it's inevitable. It's just China's probably 20 years behind Western Europe and the U.S. on this score.
The other advantage they have is it's not isolated from the rest of the world, and people from China who have had great educations at Stanford and MIT and Cambridge are now going back, having worked in Western startups, bringing their insights. They call them sea turtles. They rove around the world, but they come back to lay their eggs. I think we're out of time. So to conclude, China is both good and bad for Western economies, and we're optimists and pessimists at the same time. Is that fair?
That's very yin-yang of you. The whole
That's a very Eastern philosophy.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Everything I've said has been approved by Paddy Cosgrave's committee. Thank you, Tomas, Sophal, Zachary, and Aman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.